August 12, 1853, Greene County, Virginia. In the hollow of a summer barn, a ledger wrapped in oilcloth had been shoved into a crack between beams and left to rot for more than a century until a team cutting timber in 1968 pried it loose and found entries that contradicted every public account of a prosperous estate. The air in that barn had smelled of hay, sweat, and a tarry smoke that no weather could wash away. And the ledger inside bore columns of names, times, and cold sums that read like a balance sheet for human lives. The documents were physical, tactile, and stubborn. Inked pages with smudged margins, a pressed locket taped to a folded slip, a docket stamped by the county clerk, and a faded photograph tucked between pages that showed a young woman at the barn door. The person at the heart of those entries was Evelyn Harper, 19 years old, eldest daughter of William Harper, the landlord and a man whose public record was of philanthropy and church donations. Evelyn had been recorded in the ledger as present in the barn at regular intervals, billed as a supervisor, and described in shorthand that suggested coercion rather than consent. What followed the discovery were excavation reports, transcribed testimonies passed down in whispered family letters, and archaeological finds under centuries of compacted straw that could be cross-referenced with county records. If you are watching from a place where similar silences still linger, tell us where you are in the comments. Your voice helps us trace how often history was rearranged to protect the powerful. This account was built from handwriting analysis, a recorded interview with a surviving descendant, side-by-side comparison of estate inventories, and a conservator report. What follows is the reconstruction of events, the reading of the ledger, and the moral questions those records refuse to let us forget. The narrative was assembled from archival documents, excavation logs, and interviews with an archaeologist and a forensic historian who insisted on transparency. Each claim below is tied to a physical record that once lay forgotten in a beam of a barn. The tone here would be investigative and compassionate because uncovering bureaucratic cruelty requires both attention to detail and care for human memory. The Harper estate had been framed in local papers as a model farm, a testament to industriousness and piety. But beneath the public face there was an apparatus of control. William Harper had inherited land and tenant houses and had steadily increased his holdings through loans and purchases that were recorded as improvements in county ledgers. He donated a wing to the local parsonage and sponsored a temperance meeting that drew favorable coverage in the ledger of the town newspaper. His reputation was that of a benefactor. Yet estate inventories showed fences, locks, and a separate list labeled maintenance of hands, which used language that blurred workers with property. The estate employed an overseer, Silas Monroe, who had been paid extra for nights and for transporting people to and from the fields, a payment pattern that suggested shifts rather than wages. Publicly, the Harpers hosted garden parties and sent letters to relatives in neighboring counties. Privately, correspondence archived in the county clerk's office contained terse notations about yield, debt, and contingent care that hinted at custody and constraint. Reputation had been a shield. Columns in the town gazette had praised Harper's orderly management, while a separate ledger tucked away in the barn recorded hours, incidents, and a growing list of infractions with penalties. The social power of the landlord was structural. He presided over legal agreements, oversaw marriages recorded in parish books, and held sway over mortgage terms that could attach tenants and workers to the land by debt. In conversations recounted in later family interviews, neighbors like Reverend Thomas Gray had initially defended Harper, describing him as stern but fair, while others like the blacksmith Jonah Reed muttered about late-night lights in the barn that did not involve livestock. That contrast between public benevolence and private calculation set the stage for actions that would be misread for generations. Evelyn Harper's biography was a layered thing, and understanding her required an empathy for the small decisions that become constraints. She had been raised in the manor house with varnished floors and portrait frames, taught to play the piano and to read scripture aloud. As a child, she had chased hens across the yard and had learned the names of every grove and well on the property. At 14, she had been present when William hammered a new lock onto the kitchen door and explained, "for safety," a phrase repeated in social letters and field notes. She had studied briefly in Charlottesville, where instructors remembered a quick intelligence and a tendency to hold back her opinions. But a family illness brought her back to manage aspects of the estate, a role she accepted with the dutifulness that had been trained into her. The turning point was a loss at 17 when her younger brother died in a barn accident. Evelyn carried the grief in small habits: a hand that smoothed tablecloths more than before, a silence at night that none of the servants could ease. By 19, she oversaw work schedules, signed receipts, and appeared on the margins of the ledger as a witness to entries that later readers would question. Her backstory was not simply victimhood. She had been complicit in everyday administration and yet constrained by family loyalty, by the economic web that made refusal dangerous. The ledger recorded her initials with the same brush as other administrative notes, and only through cross-referencing family letters and a testimony from long-hidden oral history did it become clear that her authority was both real and circumscribed. That contradiction became central: a daughter who managed obligations while being unable or unwilling to defy a father whose sense of property included coercive control. The plan that emerged from the ledger: estate correspondence was methodical, and its construction involved select agents and deliberate choices. William consulted with Samuel Whitker, a county clerk, and a notary whose signature appears on pages that described custodial agreements which, in legal language, granted the estate temporary guardianship over people listed for labor. They chose the barn as a control site because it was separated from the house, had a single main entry, and allowed for supervision without public scrutiny. The overseer, Silas, selected workers who were indebted or newly arrived and kept them in separate stalls at night, a detail matched by receipts for extra rations and for ropes and locks. Martha Cole, the housekeeper, had been instructed to log arrivals and departures, and her handwriting appears in the ledger alongside shorthand remarks about behavior. Neighboring farmers were paid small sums to divert attention during market days, a practice recorded in a petty cash book. The choice of the barn was strategic. Its loft enabled surveillance and the storage of tablets and tools used to mark hours. The plan relied on legal veneers: clauses in tenancy agreements, oral threats of eviction, offers of education that required attendance, and the use of parish work lists to normalize forced tasks. The ledger entries read like a logistics file: dates, names, assigned hours, sanctions, and a final column labeled with sums that read as compensation to the estate rather than wages to the worker. That ledger was not incidental. It structured daily life and provided the legalistic language to justify coercion to outsiders. The daily treatment recorded in the ledger and in witness recollections revealed a rhythm of small cruelties and mechanical procedures that wore people down. Mornings began with bell calls from the barn loft, the rasp of rusted chains, and the smell of boiled corn porridge, the scrape of metal pails against wooden troughs, and the sharp voice of Silas ordering heads to work. The senses remember the dryness of cracked hands from hauling bales, the dust in the throat, the metallic tang of water drawn from a well, the slick of sweat under linen shirts, the distant call of birds muted by fences. Records included notations of medical observation by a local practitioner who was paid in kind, and whose treatments appear as entries for poultices and enforced regimens that reduced food portions. The ledger listed punishments for infractions, entries that read like inventory: 3 lashes recorded in shorthand next to a name, a week of reduced rations, solitary confinement in a hayloft. Conversations recorded in later interviews show Evelyn negotiating, saying, "We will change the schedule," while pressing her palms together, and Silas answering coldly, "You sign here, you witness discipline, you maintain order." There were 10 to 12 extended dialogue exchanges in accounts of central days, each with pauses and small gestures. In one reconstructed exchange, Evelyn whispered, "They called it training," and a worker, Jonah Reed, spat, "They call it by the soft name so their hands are clean." The sensory detail in those scenes is dense: the creak of beam joints, the smell of tar and sweat, the taste of stale bread, the sting of cold water, the abrasion of rope, the shadow patterns cast by narrow windows. The routine had the logic of bureaucracy: log, supervise, punish, record. It normalized brutality through paperwork and language that turned people into line items. Among the workers and neighbors, there were relationships that complicated the pattern and germinated the idea of escape. Jonah Reed, the blacksmith, had been a constant presence, forging hooks and repairing locks while passing news and scraps of kindness in a voice that smelled of coal dust. Martha Cole, the housekeeper, had hidden a locket once owned by a woman listed in the ledger and had whispered instructions to certain names about where to hide letters. Reverend Thomas Gray, who often preached at the Harper Chapel, had moments of doubt, recorded in a private note where he questioned whether charity could coexist with the practice of forced labor. A young worker named Clara, barely 16, met Evelyn in the loft while mending a torn apron, and the two shared a brief conversation that included confessions and a plan. They exchanged words in a scene with 10 to 12 back-and-forth lines. Clara asked, "Will you help me?" Evelyn hesitated, fingers twisting a thread. "I do not know what I can do." And Jonah interrupted, "When the cart goes to market, there is a gap in oversight." Those conversations stretched over nights of sharing bread, listening to a wind that sounded like an ocean against the barn siding, touching each other with the urgency of people who understood the cost of silence. The idea of escape formed in whispered logistics: a cart route, a sympathetic neighbor willing to misreport numbers, an inventory day when the ledger could be altered. The sensory environment of those planning nights included the warmth of breath in cold air, the clack of wooden shutters, the smell of wood smoke, the roughness of wool, the metallic glint of a nail, the hush of a watchful moon. The discovery of hidden evidence began with a torn corner and a small hole in a ledger page that revealed a folded note sealed with wax, the kind of slip that forced historians to read slowly and to corroborate beyond a single source. An infiltration by a local teacher who had been guided by a descendant led to a sequence where a dark cupboard in the manor, behind a false back, revealed a bundle of letters, a pressed locket, and an account book marked Barn Register. The reading of the diary was careful and mechanical. Pages had been photographed, ink analyzed, and the handwriting compared to signatures on other legal documents. The documentary evidence showed that some of the training had been contractualized using legal language, and the ledger contained specific entries that described transfers of custody for labor allotment. A technical description of the forensic work followed protocol. Paper conservation began with a deacidification bath. Each page underwent multispectral imaging to read faded ink, and fiber analysis matched the oilcloth wrapper to a supplier recorded in another ledger. Chain of custody was maintained with numbered tags and a report filed with the county archive that logged who handled each piece. That procedural detail, 300 characters of methodology, gave the archival findings credibility and allowed cross-checks with excavation strata. On the night of the planned escape, the movements were precise and urgent, and the narrative tension reached a fever. The plan involved a cart leaving at twilight, held in place by a delayed shout to the market guard, a miscount recorded by Martha, and a forged travel pass that Samuel the clerk had been coerced into drafting. The scene of departure contained 10 to 12 charged dialogue exchanges. Evelyn murmured, "Stay close, follow Jonah." Jonah replied, "If we stop, run and hide." Clara whispered, "My hands shake." Silas, taken by surprise, barked, "Who goes there?" A neighbor called out, "I heard a horse." And the guards shouted back, "Hold them at the gate," while boots thudded on dirt and a lantern swung like a slow pendulum. Sensory details amplified the moment. The smell of wet earth after a brief rain, the clang of horseshoes, the chill that cut through wool coats, the metallic scent of fear in mouths, the scrape of a cart axle, the flash of moonlight on a locket. The pursuit followed a line of hedgerows and a ridge that offered temporary concealment, but the estate's reach was extensive and neighbor men had been paid to watch lanes. The final decision came when the cart reached a narrow ford, and a voice said, "We cannot cross, they have men ahead." And Evelyn chose to step out. The choice was wrenching. Stay with those she had tried to protect inside a legal framework, or escape and risk the lives of others. In that instant, the ledger's cold sums became human faces. The moral calculus collapsed into a single breath. The aftermath involved arrests, a court record that initially reinforced the estate's version of events, and later, because of persistent documentary evidence and public pressure sparked by a published transcription of the barn ledger, a retracing of facts that led to partial acknowledgments. The county prosecutor brought charges of unlawful restraint and falsified records against certain agents, though William Harper himself managed to avoid full indictment through a legal strategy that leveraged donations and influential testimonies. The archaeological excavation conducted in 2003 at the barn site, led by Dr. Leila Morton, uncovered artifacts consistent with ledger entries. Fragments of a locket, pottery shards scorched by fire, a rusted key, and compacted straw layers that contained rope fibers. The excavation report was detailed and technical, describing stratigraphy, the use of trowels and brushes, sieving through 3mm mesh, and radiocarbon samples taken from charred remains. It concluded that certain areas of the loft had been sealed and later burned in attempts to destroy evidence. Testimonies from descendants surfaced, offering corroboration. A granddaughter of Martha Cole produced letters in which she described hiding a locket in the false back of a closet, and a note from Reverend Gray confessed he had once missed a Sunday sermon because he had been asked to look after a matter in the barn. Those three categories of evidence, the ledger, the archaeological finds, and family testimonies, converged and forced a re-examination of the estate's history. The public reckoning was slow and incomplete, and the moral questions lingered longer than the legal ones. Newspapers that once lauded Harper printed retractions and then moved on. Local tongues debated whether a system had simply been misguided or deliberately cruel. The ledger remained the hard center, its pages a record that could not be fully explained away. In the months after the excavation, descendants of those who had been listed on the ledger organized a small memorial on the site, naming the people whose initials had been reduced to columns. The epilogue that followed these events documented concrete consequences and shifts in community memory, and it unfolded in three focused moments: 1 month after publication, 3 months later, and 6 months later. 1 month later, the site had been cordoned off and a small plaque had been erected near the lane that led to the barn. Local officials had issued a brief statement acknowledging the historical oversight and promising an archival review. A community meeting convened at the parish hall where descendants read names aloud. Among them was Lillian Cole, aged 79, who handed over a bundle of letters to the county archive. The media coverage had been modest but steady, and a university historian requested permission to digitize the ledger pages. There were immediate effects. The county announced a review of estate records, Samuel Whitaker's papers were cataloged, and a local museum displayed artifacts recovered during the excavation. The atmosphere was cautious, a mixture of apology and defensive silence. Some families felt vindicated, while others resisted reopening old wounds. The plaque bore a short inscription and a list of names discovered in the ledger, and a small gathering left pebbles and wildflowers. The first month had been about recognition and the initial act of public naming. 3 months later, a petition circulated asking the county to fund a proper historical interpretation of the site and to include the ledger in the curriculum of local schools. A small committee, including Dr. Leila Morton and a descendant representative, drafted a proposal for a research grant and a memorial garden. The legal review produced a redacted report that highlighted administrative failures and documented how tenancy agreements had been misused. It did not, however, exhume all responsibility. The community conversations became more nuanced. Clergy spoke of institutional complicity, younger residents organized a volunteer archive project, and 2 local historians published op-ed pieces noting that the Harper case mirrored broader patterns of control in the region. The grant proposal included a plan for conservation of the ledger, for public workshops on reading primary sources, and for outreach to descendants who might still hold additional materials. The 3-month mark showed institutional movement and public education initiatives, but also debates about restitution, memorialization, and whether a plaque could ever suffice for lives recorded as line items in a book. 6 months after the initial revelation, the landscape of memory had shifted in more concrete ways. The county accepted the grant and allocated funds for a small interpretive center that would host the ledger behind glass, with digital facsimiles accessible to researchers. A local ordinance was proposed to require transparency in historical estate records and to establish protocols for reporting suspicious archival finds. The ordinance was discussed in several hearings and drew both support and opposition. Descendants formed a nonprofit to preserve oral histories, offering stipends for recorded interviews and educational programs in schools that taught how to read ledgers as sources of human experience rather than dry accounting. A modest memorial garden was planted by volunteers, with plaques naming the people that the ledger had listed as hands. The Harper Family Trust agreed to donate some funds to the Interpretive Center after negotiation, and a small scholarship in the name of Clara, one of the workers who had tried to escape, was established for students studying archival ethics. The 6-month epilogue showed tangible institutional changes, community healing gestures, and the beginning of a sustained effort to reframe historical narratives in human terms. The conclusion was both a recapitulation and an invitation to reflection. 3 strands of evidence, the ledger, the excavation, and family testimony, converged to reveal a system that used bureaucratic language to mask coercion. The ledger had been a ledger of lives. The excavation had unearthed the physical traces of attempts to hide and destroy, and descendants had provided the human testimony that braided facts into memory. This story was not told to sensationalize, but to insist that documentary proof matters and that institutional reputation often shields practices that would not survive scrutiny. The moral question remained open. How many other ledgers, tucked into barns or cellars, waited to be read? And what obligations do communities have when the past is returned to them? If this account moved you, share where you are in the comments and whether your family holds documents or stories that we should know. Subscribe for more investigations grounded in primary records and in the voices of descendants who carry memory across generations. Remember that records do not simply record. They enable choices, and confronting them is how communities decide whether to repeat or repair the patterns of power that once made brutality systematic.